May 12, 1968. 40 kilometers northeast of Saigon, the last Iroquois helicopter lifts away into the humid twilight, rotor washing the elephant grass around Fire Support Base Coral. In shallow fighting pits barely 2 feet deep, Australian soldiers from the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment stare into the darkening rubber plantation to their north. They do not know that 9 kilometers away, in a concealed bunker complex beneath the jungle canopy, the commander of the North Vietnamese Army's 7th Division is watching them through binoculars. Tonight, his battalions will attack. And before you continue, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for Vietnam War Records, because we bring you the most detailed, historically accurate accounts of the Vietnam War you won't find anywhere else. This is the story of how Australian diggers turned human wave assaults into killing fields, how engineers and infantrymen held positions that should have been overrun, and how a single battle destroyed one of North Vietnam's most elite divisions. This is Coral Balmoral. The rain begins at 6 in the evening. Cold, heavy, tropical rain that fills the incomplete weapon pits and turns the red Vietnamese earth into slick mud. The Australians have been on the ground for less than 8 hours. There has been no time to dig proper bunkers, no time to string concertina wire or position claymore mines. The barbed wire has not even arrived from the rear echelon. Some men stand in shell scrapes so shallow they barely cover their boots. Others crouch beside artillery pieces that still bear the dust from the helicopter ride north. This is not how defensive positions are supposed to look. This is not how battles are supposed to begin. But in Vietnam, nothing happens the way it is supposed to. The deployment to Coral has been chaos from the first moment. The original landing zone proved unsuitable. The ground too soft for the Chinook helicopters carrying the heavy guns. A new landing zone had to be designated mid-operation. 1,000 meters to the southwest, radio communications failed repeatedly. Units arrived scattered across 3 kilometers of rubber plantation and open ground. The 102nd Field Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery landed before the infantry companies that were supposed to secure their position. The New Zealand gunners of the 161st Battery found themselves in a clearing a kilometer southwest of the main base, isolated and exposed. By the time the companies of Lieutenant Colonel Philip Bennett's 1st Battalion arrived, there were only 2 hours of daylight remaining. 2 hours to establish a perimeter that should have taken 2 days to prepare. 2 hours before nightfall in an area where intelligence reported only scattered enemy forces withdrawing from their failed assault on Saigon. The intelligence is catastrophically wrong. Unknown to the Australians digging their hasty positions in the fading light, the headquarters of the North Vietnamese Army's 7th Division sits less than 6 miles to the east. The division's 165 Regiment operates to the north. The 141st Regiment holds positions to the east. The 275 Infiltration Group, fresh from the Ho Chi Minh Trail and arriving in the area only 48 hours earlier, waits in assembly areas marked on hand-drawn maps. These are not scattered guerrillas fleeing the disaster in Saigon. These are regular North Vietnamese Army soldiers, hardened veterans of conventional warfare, equipped with modern weapons and led by officers who studied at military academies in Hanoi and Beijing. They have mortars and rockets and heavy machine guns. They have reconnaissance teams that spent the afternoon observing the Australian deployment, noting every gap in the perimeter, every exposed gun position, every incomplete defensive arrangement. And they have orders to attack tonight. At 10 minutes past midnight, 5 minutes after the rain finally stops, the one raw mortar position is probed by a small North Vietnamese reconnaissance patrol. A brief firefight erupts in the darkness, red tracers arcing through the wet air, the sharp crack of M16 rifles answered by the heavier thump of AK-47s. Possibly 3 enemy soldiers are killed. The Australians report contact and return to watching the perimeter. They do not realize the patrol was marking assault lanes, designating the exact positions where the main attack will fall. At 25 minutes past 2 in the morning, 3 North Vietnamese soldiers walked directly into an ambush position held by D Company, 1RR, 2,500 meters north of the firebase. The others fire rocket-propelled grenades into the trees and disappear into the 11 are wounded by a single RPG that detonates perfectly positioned to maximize casualties. The fragments tear through a platoon position like a scythe through wheat. Still, the Australians do not realize what is coming. At exactly 3:30 in the morning, the darkness erupts. Rocket and mortar fire falls on fire support base Coral in a concentrated bombardment that lasts 5 minutes but feels like 5 hours. The shells fall with mathematical precision on the 102nd Field Battery gun positions and the 1 Ra mortar platoon. These are not random ranging shots. This is accurate, pre-registered fire directed by observers who spent yesterday afternoon calculating distances and azimuths. The mortars scream out of the black sky and detonate among the Australian positions with white phosphorus flashes that illuminate scenes of instant chaos. Men dive for shallow pits that offer almost no protection. Sandbags that were supposed to be filled by now do not exist. Overhead cover that was scheduled for construction tomorrow will never be built. Then, after 5 minutes of bombardment, the mortars stop. There is absolute silence except for the ringing in men's ears and the moans of the wounded. Australian sentries peer into the darkness, seeing nothing, hearing nothing. Some check their weapons, others drag wounded men toward cover. And then, without warning, flares burst overhead. Red and green tracers arc into the sky, from the rubber plantation to the northeast. Signal flares, illumination flares, and the screaming begins. 2 companies of the North Vietnamese 141st Regiment, augmented by the 275 and 269th Infiltration Groups, come out of the darkness at a dead run, firing their assault rifles from the hip as they charge across the 250 meters of open ground that separate the wood line from the Australian perimeter. They run in long, straight lines across a front 150 to 200 men wide, wave after wave, and they are screaming. The human wave assault, the tactic that Mao Zedong used to destroy nationalist Chinese divisions, the tactic that sent American Marines reeling back from the Choshin Reservoir in Korea, comes out of the Vietnam night aimed directly at the weakest point in the Australian defences. 18 men, their position adjacent to the gun line, forward of the artillery, exposed on the outer edge of the firebase facing northeast. They are standing to their weapons when the assault hits. They have no time to fire their mortars. The North Vietnamese are among them in seconds, firing at point-blank range, hurling grenades, bayoneting men in their fighting pits. 5 Australians die in the first 30 seconds. 8 more are wounded. The mortar position is overrun. The enemy does not stop. The assault waves flow past the captured mortars and surge directly toward the 6 105mm howitzers of the 102nd Field Battery. The guns laid facing east, crews scrambling to traverse them toward the northeast where the attack is coming from. But one gun, number 6 gun, on the extreme edge of the battery position, was firing a mission to the north just minutes before the assault began. That gun is pointed directly at the advancing enemy, and as the first North Vietnamese soldiers reach the mortar position, that gun fires. The sound is not the normal crack of high-explosive artillery. This is different, sharper, flatter, the sound of 8,000 steel flechettes, each 1 4 inches long and razor-sharp, leaving the barrel at 28,700 feet per second. The Flechette round, called Beehive by the Americans who developed it, is essentially a shotgun shell the size of a trash can. The shell flies downrange for approximately 50 meters, then a timed fuse blows the casing open, and 8,000 tiny arrows spray forward in a cone of death 40 meters wide. Everything in that cone, every living thing, is shredded. The first wave of North Vietnamese soldiers running across the open ground simply ceases to exist. Bodies are thrown backward, torn apart, the assault wave broken into scattered groups, and individual soldiers who hesitate, confused, unable to understand what has just killed the men beside them. The other guns of 102nd Battery traverse frantically, crews heaving on the trails to swing the barrels toward the northeast. The gun sergeants scream fire orders. Flechette. 0 elevation, point blank. The guns fire over open sights, the crews watching through the sights as the rounds impact the advancing enemy at ranges under the 100 meters. Each gun fires as fast as the crew can load. The breech slams open, ejecting the hot brass casing. Loaders ram another shell. The breech closes. Fire. Again, the sustained firing creates a wall of steel darts between the guns and the enemy. Thousands upon thousands of flechettes whipping through the air with a sound like a million angry wasps. The sound that gives the round its name. Men who survived the Battle of Coral will say they can still hear that sound in their nightmares 50 years later. But the North Vietnamese do not break. Follow-up waves keep coming, moving in short rushes between the trees, using the rubber plantation for cover, working around the flanks where the Flechette fire is less concentrated. Small groups reach the gun line. Desperate close quarters fighting erupts between the artillery emplacements. Australians fire pistols and rifles at ranges of 3 meters. Grenades detonate inside gun pits. Bayonets are used. Men fight hand-to-hand in the darkness, illuminated only by the flash of explosions and the continuous firing of the howitzers. The North Vietnamese succeed in capturing a number 1 6-gun on the extreme edge of the position. Satchel charges are placed. Australian gunners fight with entrenching tools and fists to drive them back. 200 meters to the south, Lieutenant Les Tranter commands the 1 Ra anti-tank platoon equipped with 90mm M67 recoilless rifles. These weapons, designed to destroy tanks with high-explosive anti-tank warheads, also fire Flechette rounds. Each 90mm canister contains 2,400 steel darts. Tranter's crews sight their weapons across the front of the overrun mortar position and fire. The backblast from the recoilless rifles creates clouds of dust and debris, but the effect downrange is devastating. The Flechettes sweep across the captured mortar position, killing everything above ground, including some of the Australian wounded who cannot take cover. But the fire relieves the immediate pressure. The North Vietnamese assault, which has achieved penetration of the perimeter and captured ground inside the Australian firebase, begins to slow. Follow-up sections hesitate at the mortar position, unsure whether to advance into the wall of fire or consolidate the ground they have taken, and then Lieutenant Tony Jensen, second in command of the 1 RAR mortar platoon, radios the most desperate fire mission of the battle. He directs the recoilless rifle fire onto his own position. Fire on us, fire on our position. The North Vietnamese are trying to turn the captured Australian mortars against the defenders. Jensen can see enemy soldiers working the tubes, attempting to understand the unfamiliar weapons. He makes the decision that saves the firebase. The Flechette rounds from the 90mm recoilless rifles sweep across the mortar position again. Everything above ground level is destroyed. Several Australian mortar tubes are damaged beyond repair by the steel darts, but the North Vietnamese attempt to hold the position fails. Bodies lie in piles around the mortars. The assault has reached its high water mark. At the gun line, the battery is running out of Flechette ammunition. Each gun carried only a limited supply of the specialized rounds. The number 2-on-1 gun crew, acting on his own initiative, changes the fuses on high-explosive rounds to delay and depresses the gun tube to fire the shells directly into the ground 40 to 50 meters in front of the position. The shell buries itself in the soft earth for a fraction of a second. Then the delayed fuse detonates and the shell ricochets upward, exploding in the air above the heads of the advancing enemy. It is an expedient measure, improvised in the chaos of close combat, but it works. The air-bursting shells create a curtain of shrapnel that the North Vietnamese cannot penetrate. Gun crews across the battery adopt the technique. They fire as fast as they can load, the hot gun tubes glowing dull red in the darkness, the breech mechanism slamming open and closed in a continuous rhythm that will leave some crews partially deaf for the rest of their lives. Above the battle, American AC-47 spooky gunships orbit with their side-mounted miniguns, firing 6,000 rounds per minute into the rubber plantation where the enemy reserve forces wait. Continuous illumination flares drift down on parachutes, turning night into a flickering daylight that casts harsh shadows across the battlefield. Forward observers adjust American artillery fire to within 20 meters of the Australian positions, a suicidal distance, shells screaming overhead so close that the Australians can feel the wind of their passage. 1 Huey gunships make low passes, door gunners firing M60 machine guns, rocket pods rippling fire into the tree line. The entire firebase is surrounded by a ring of explosions and fire and traces, and in the center of it all, Australian soldiers fight for their lives against an enemy that should have overwhelmed them in the first 5 minutes. By 4:30 in the morning, after an hour of continuous combat, the main North Vietnamese assault begins to falter. The casualties are unsustainable. Bodies lie strewn across the approaches to the gun line. The rubber plantation to the northeast is a shattered wasteland of splintered trees and cratered earth. The enemy begins to withdraw, carrying their dead and wounded, firing rearguard actions to prevent the Australians from following. But a company-sized force remains in contact, attempting to cover the withdrawal and prevent immediate pursuit. At 5 o'clock, taking advantage of a moment when the Australians extinguish a fire they have been using to direct helicopter gunship fire, the North Vietnamese launch one final assault. This time they are fewer in number, already badly depleted, and the attack is broken up almost immediately in a crossfire of high explosive and the last remaining Flechette rounds. A series of sporadic contacts continues as the enemy withdraws through the rubber plantation. At 5:30, helicopter gunships drive the North Vietnamese rear guard from its positions. By 6:25 in the morning, as the pre-dawn light begins to appear in the east, fire support base Coral is finally secure. The Australians begin to sweep the perimeter. The 102nd Field Battery clears the gun position. Lieutenant Colonel Bennett accompanies the anti-tank platoon and a medical team to clear the mortar area. Patrols from 3 RAs sweep from north to south. North Vietnamese soldiers are found hiding in weapon pits, in shell craters, among the rubber trees. The last enemy soldier is killed at the gun position at 10 minutes past 6. 2 patrols meet in the devastated mortar position. The mortars themselves are wrecked, tubes bent, base plates cracked, sights destroyed. Spent shell casings carpet the ground. Blood soaks into the red. At 6:30, helicopters begin arriving to evacuate the Australian dead and wounded. 9 killed, 28 wounded, 1 howitzer, and 2 mortars damaged. Around the perimeter, 52 North Vietnamese bodies lie where they fell. 23 rifles and 7 crew-served weapons are collected. Blood trails lead into the rubber plantation. Later intelligence will estimate that the North Vietnamese 141st Regiment committed approximately 800 soldiers to the assault. Fewer than 100 escaped unwounded. Radio Hanoi announces a great victory. The Australian firebase has been overrun, they claim. The artillery has been destroyed. Dozens of Australian soldiers are dead. The broadcast is propaganda, but it contains a kernel of truth that disturbs the Australian command. The firebase very nearly was overrun. The defences were inadequate. The deployment was rushed and poorly coordinated. The lack of proper reconnaissance before the insertion allowed the Australians to land practically on top of the 7th NVA Division headquarters without knowing it. The fortunes of war, a gun tube pointed in the right direction at the right moment, the courage of soldiers who refused to break under overwhelming assault, saved fire support base Coral from becoming a catastrophe. But lessons must be learned. The Australians consolidate their positions. Barbed wire arrives. Claymore mines are emplaced. Interlocking fields of fire are carefully coordinated. Overhead protection is constructed. Major John Keldy, commander of A Squadron, 3rd Cavalry Regiment, is appointed as local defense commander to coordinate all defensive arrangements. The Australians are not going to be caught unprepared again. 4 days later, at 2:30 in the morning on May 16th, the North Vietnamese attack again. This time there is no surprise. The Australians are ready. The night before, defenders observed a large number of lights and flares in the rubber plantation to the north and east. Whenever the enemy is planning, it is not subtle. The 141st Regiment, having withdrawn to regroup after its disastrous assault on the 13th, is preparing to try again. At 2:30, the pre-attack bombardment begins. Rockets and mortars fall on A Company, 1 RR on the 1 ATF headquarters and on the forward task force maintenance area. But this time the Australian response is immediate and overwhelming. 60 guns open fire simultaneously, 3 batteries of 105mm field guns, 1 battery of 155mm howitzers, 1 battery of 8-inch guns, 981mm mortars. The counter-battery fire falls on the North Vietnamese assault positions with crushing weight. 3 helicopter gunship teams orbit overhead, firing rockets and mini-guns into the tree line. 3 fighter bombers are on station with bombs and napalm. At 2:40, the North Vietnamese battalion-sized assault emerges from the rubber plantation and immediately runs into a wall of high explosive. The Australian artillery fires close defensive fire tasks, some shells landing within 50 meters of friendly positions. The assault reaches the perimeter. Part of 3 Platoon A Company is overrun. Lieutenant Neil Weeks, the platoon commander, has already suffered several casualties from the preliminary bombardment. Now North Vietnamese soldiers are inside his position firing at point-blank range. Weeks orders his men to fix bayonets. The command has not been given in the Australian Army since the Second World War. The soldiers of 3 Platoon fix their long blade bayonets to their SLR rifles and counterattack to regain their own fighting pits. Weeks calls in mortar fire to within 20 meters of his position. The close fire support is devastatingly accurate. The North Vietnamese assault, which achieved penetration of the perimeter just as it did 4 days earlier, cannot exploit the breakthrough. The gap is sealed. Weeks reorganizes his position and he will later be awarded the Military Cross for his leadership during the assault. The North Vietnamese broaden the attack, engaging 3 of the 4 Australian rifle companies on the perimeter. They succeed in opening gaps in the wire. Bangalore torpedoes detonate, blasting lanes through the obstacles. But the follow-up waves do not press home their attacks. The firepower is too intense. By 4 o'clock in the morning, A Company is still heavily engaged, but the main assault has failed to achieve a breakthrough. Helicopter light fire teams and a C-47 gunships drop continuous illumination. At 5 in the morning, the North Vietnamese begin to withdraw. The Australians are running low on ammunition. Mi-113 armored personnel carriers race forward to resupply the rifle companies. A recoilless rifle team is pushed forward to provide additional firepower. At 5:15, the enemy attacks again, targeting the boundary between A and C companies on the northern edge of the perimeter. The assault is repelled by concentrated mortar fire. Later, a two-battalion attack strikes A, B, and C companies simultaneously. The attack is turned back by the massed fires of tanks, artillery, and mortars. The Australians counterattack with elements of A Company supported by APCs, regaining the lost section post in 3 platoons area. At 6:30 in the morning, after a 6-hour battle, the North Vietnamese break contact and withdraw, fighting rearguard actions to prevent Australian pursuit. 5 Australians are dead. 19 are wounded. 2 American artillerymen are also wounded. At dawn, the Australians count 34 North Vietnamese bodies on the perimeter. But intelligence reports later indicate that fewer than 100 of the 790 attacking soldiers survived the battle unwounded. The 141st Regiment has been destroyed as a combat-effective force. It will not attack again. Brigadier Ron Hughes, commander of the 1st Australian Task Force, makes a critical decision. The Australians will not attempt to pursue and destroy the enemy through aggressive patrolling as they did in Phuoc Thu Province. Instead, they will establish heavily defended fire support bases and destroy. The fire base becomes a fortress. The Australians will patrol from these positions during the day to locate enemy forces, then withdraw to the fortified perimeters at night and dare the North Vietnamese to attack. It is a tactic that plays to Australian strengths: superior firepower, excellent artillery support, coordinated combined arms operations. It is also a tactic that requires nerves of steel from the soldiers manning the perimeter, knowing that every night might bring another human wave assault out of the darkness. On May 24th, 3 RA moves north. Lieutenant Colonel Jim Shelton's battalion establishes fire support base Balmoral 4.5 kilometers north of Coral. The position is intended to extend Australian control over the area of operations, to patrol likely enemy infiltration routes, and to keep pressure on the withdrawing North Vietnamese units. The battalion deploys with 4 rifle companies: A Company, B Company, C Company, and D Company. The New Zealand gunners of the 161st Battery deployed to provide artillery support. Engineers from 1 Field Squadron, Royal Australian Engineers, under the command of Lieutenant George Hulse, established defensive positions that will occupy almost 1/3 of the fighting perimeter. This is the first and only combat deployment in the history of the Royal Australian Engineers, where an Australian engineer group operates as an integral part of a brigade-strength battle group. The engineers are not rear echelon support troops. They are frontline combat soldiers who will man the perimeter alongside the infantry and hold their positions against whatever comes out of the jungle. And most critically, just hours before the first attack, 4 Centurion tanks from C Squadron, 1st Armoured Regiment arrive at Balmoral after a harrowing journey from Coral. The tanks are British-made Centurion Mark V/1S, 52 tons of steel and firepower, equipped with 200 main guns and 50 caliber machine guns. The tankers have fought through several ambushes during the one tank has thrown a track and had to be repaired under fire. But they arrive and they take up positions on the perimeter just as the sun is setting. The tank commanders do not know it yet, but their presence will save fire support base Balmoral. At 3:45 in the morning on May 26, rocket and mortar fire falls on the northern perimeter of Balmoral. The preparatory bombardment is shorter than previous attacks, lasting only minutes, but the accuracy is disturbing. These are not random harassment fires. This is directed fire from forward observers who have reconnoitered the position. Before the bombardment lifts, the assault begins. 2 battalions of the North Vietnamese 165th Regiment, perhaps 800 to 1,000 soldiers, emerge from the darkness and charge the northern perimeter where D Company, 3 RA, holds the line. The attack falls primarily on D Company's positions. The North Vietnamese come in waves, running across open ground, firing from the hip, screaming. It is the same tactic that nearly succeeded at Coral on May 13th, the same human wave assault that overwhelmed Chinese nationalist divisions, that drove the Americans back in Korea. Wave after wave of soldiers willing to die to close with the enemy, to get inside the perimeter where superior firepower cannot be brought to bear, to engage in close-quarters combat where numbers and determination matter more than technology. Against most defensive positions, the tactic works. The attackers suffer horrific casualties, but enough men reach the perimeter to achieve a breakthrough. And once the perimeter is breached, the defense collapses. But at Balmoral, there are tanks. The 4 Centurion tanks are positioned directly on the assault route, their main guns and machine guns covering the approaches to D Company. As the first wave of North Vietnamese soldiers reaches the wire, the tanks open fire. The 20-pounder main guns fire canister rounds, each shell containing hundreds of steel balls that turn the gun into a massive shotgun. The .50 caliber machine guns, each one capable of firing 500 rounds per minute, sweep the assault waves with interlocking fire. The combined firepower of the tanks, the infantry machine guns, the artillery firing from within the perimeter, and the mortars creates a killing zone that no human wave can cross. The North Vietnamese keep coming. They are brave, they are disciplined, they are determined, and they die in piles in front of bodies stack up in the wire. Wounded men try to crawl back to the tree line and are killed by artillery fire falling on the approaches. The assault waves become smaller, the gaps between them longer, until finally the attack falters and breaks. The North Vietnamese withdraw, leaving their dead behind, carrying as many wounded as they can. 1 Australian is killed. 7 are wounded. Enemy losses are estimated at between 24 and 45 dead, but those are only the bodies found on the perimeter. The blood trails leading back into the jungle suggest casualties are far higher. The 165th Regiment regroups. They have failed, but they are not finished. 2 days later, at 2:30 in the morning on May 28th, they attack again. This time, it is not a 2-battalion assault. This time, it is the entire regiment, perhaps 1,500 soldiers, in a regimental-strength attack that represents the North Vietnamese 7th Division's last operational reserve. This is everything they have. If this attack fails, the division is finished as a combat-effective force. The attack begins with a heavy mortar and rocket-propelled grenade barrage across the northern perimeter. The North Vietnamese have learned from the previous assault. They attempt to suppress the tanks with RPG fire, hoping to disable the vehicles before the infantry assault begins. The RPGs impact the Centurion armor and bounce off. The tanks are designed to withstand high-velocity anti-tank rounds. The RPGs, shaped charges optimized for penetrating thin armor at close range, are less effective against the heavy frontal armor of a Centurion. The tanks return fire. The infantry assault emerges from the tree line, wave after wave, perhaps the largest single assault of the entire battle. They run into the same wall of fire that destroyed the assault on May 26th, only this time it is worse. The artillery has pre-registered defensive fire tasks on every approach. The mortars fire continuously. The tanks fire main gun and machine gun simultaneously. The crews working with practiced efficiency, loading and firing and loading again. The noise is indescribable. The sustained firing creates a physical pressure wave that makes breathing difficult. Spent shell casings pile up around the gun positions. The ground shakes with the impact of artillery shells falling just beyond the wire, and the assault breaks. Not slowly, not gradually, but suddenly. One moment there are soldiers running forward through the fire. The next moment there are only bodies and smoke and the sound of wounded men screaming in the darkness. The North Vietnamese break off the assault after 30 minutes. 30 minutes of sustained combat that feels like 30 hours. They withdraw, this time not in an organized fighting retreat, but in a rout. They leave behind at least 42 dead and 7 prisoners. They also leave behind any hope of achieving their objective. The 165th Regiment, like the 141st before it, has been destroyed as a combat-effective force. The 7th NVA Division, one of North Vietnam's elite formations, a division that fought in the siege of Khe Sanh, a division that participated in the Tet Offensive and the May Offensive, is finished. It will not conduct another major operation for months. The battle continues through early June, but the major assaults are over. The Australians patrol aggressively during the day, making contact with scattered enemy forces, calling in artillery and airstrikes on bunker complexes and staging areas. There are firefights and ambushes and small unit actions, but nothing on the scale of the human wave assaults on Coral and Balmoral. The North Vietnamese are withdrawing, trying to preserve what remains of their units, trying to evacuate their wounded and regroup in base areas along the Cambodian border. On June 6, 1968, after 26 days of continuous operations, The 1st Australian Task Force withdraws from the area of operations and returns to Nui Dat. American and South Vietnamese forces take over responsibility for the sector. The Battle of Coral Balmoral is over. The casualties tell part of the story. 26 Australian soldiers killed in action, over 100 wounded, 2 men from 12th Field Regiment, 1 from 104 Signal Squadron, 16 from 1 RA, 6 from 3 RA, 1 from 161st Independent Reconnaissance Squadron. Each name is recorded, each man is remembered. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra holds their records, their photographs, their letters home. On the other side, Australian claims of enemy casualties total between 267 and 327 killed, with 11 captured. Hundreds of weapons recovered. But the numbers do not tell the real story. The real story is that the 7th NVA Division ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. A veteran named Lachlan Irvine, who fought at Balmoral, wrote years later, "The attacks on Coral and Balmoral effectively destroyed the 7th NVA Division and ended its ability to take part in the May Offensive in Saigon. That is the measure of Australian victory." An entire North Vietnamese division, 3 regiments, thousands of soldiers eliminated from the order of battle, unable to attack, unable to reinforce, unable to conduct operations. The division's planned assault on Saigon is postponed, then cancelled, then abandoned. The May Offensive, the second phase of Tet, collapses in the Thai Corps area not just because of American and South Vietnamese resistance in Saigon, but because the North Vietnamese forces attempting to withdraw through the Australian sector are destroyed before they can reach safety. The tactical innovations of the battle become doctrine. The use of Flechette rounds at point-blank range is studied by artillery schools. The defensive coordination between tanks and infantry becomes a model for fire-based defense. The role of engineers as combat troops holding significant portions of the perimeter is analyzed and incorporated into planning. Lieutenant George Hulse, who commanded one troop of 1 field squadron at Coral, later wrote about the experience. His engineers, he said, occupied almost 1/3 of the fighting perimeter for the full duration of the operation of 26 days and repelled human wave ground attacks from NAA units during the heaviest fighting at FSPB Coral on the 16th of May 1968. The engineers held fast. That simple phrase, "the engineers held fast," carries enormous weight. Engineers are not supposed to be frontline combat troops. They build bridges and clear mines and construct fortifications. But at Coral and Balmoral, Australian engineers fought as infantry, held their positions under human wave assault and refused to break. It is a forgotten part of the battle, overshadowed by the artillery duels and the tank actions and the desperate infantry fighting. But without the engineers holding 1/3 of the perimeter, the defenses would have failed. The comparison to the Battle of Long Tan is inevitable. Long Tan, fought in August 1966, is Australia's most famous Vietnam War battle. D Company, 6 RA, 108 men, ambushed by perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers in a rubber plantation during a monsoon rainstorm. A 3-hour battle in which the Australians held their position against overwhelming odds until reinforcements and artillery support broke the enemy attack. 18 Australians killed, 24 wounded. Australian claims of 245 enemy killed, 350 wounded. Long Tan is remembered. Long Tan is commemorated. Long Tan has a cross that marks the battlefield, a memorial service every year, books and films and documentaries. Coral Balmoral is largely forgotten, but the numbers tell a different story. Coral Balmoral was larger, 26 Australians killed compared to 18 at Long Tan, over 100 wounded compared to 24. Enemy casualties 2 to 3 times higher. And most significantly, Coral Balmoral lasted 26 days, not 3 hours. It was Australia's largest and longest battle of the Vietnam War. It was conventional warfare on a scale the Australians had not experienced since the Second World War. It was the only time Australian forces faced regimental-strength North Vietnamese army units in sustained combat, and the Australians won. The victory had strategic implications. The postponement of further attacks on Saigon gave the South Vietnamese government and the American command time to recover from the May Offensive. The destruction of the 7th NVA Division removed a significant threat from the Thai Corps area. The blocking of withdrawal routes forced other North Vietnamese units to take longer, more dangerous paths back to their base areas, exposing them to airstrikes and artillery harassment. The battle demonstrated that Australian tactics, small unit professionalism, and superior firepower could defeat numerically superior North Vietnamese forces even in conventional warfare. It validated the Australian approach to the war, which differed significantly from American search and destroy operations. The Americans sought to find the enemy and destroy him through mobility and overwhelming force. The Australians built strong positions and dared the enemy to attack, then destroyed him with coordinated firepower. Both approaches worked. But at Balmoral, the Australian method was vindicated in the most dramatic way possible. The psychological impact on both sides cannot be measured but was certainly significant. For the North Vietnamese soldiers who survived the assaults on Coral and Balmoral, the experience must have been traumatic. To advance repeatedly into walls of Flechette fire and artillery, to watch wave after wave of comrades cut down, to suffer casualty rates of 70 to 80% and achieve nothing, destroys the morale of even the most dedicated troops. The 7th NVA Division would eventually reconstitute, but it would take months, and the division would never again be as effective as it was before Balmoral. For the Australians, the experience was equally profound. They had stood against human wave assaults that should have overrun their positions. They had held inadequate defences through sheer courage and firepower. They had fought and won the largest battle in Australian military history since the Second World War. But the cost was high. 26 men dead, over 100 wounded, and the knowledge that they had come very close to disaster, that on the night of May 1230, the firebase was nearly overrun, that only luck and courage and Flechette rounds fired at the last possible moment prevented catastrophe. The battle is remembered every May 12th by the Australian veterans who fought there, by the families of the men who died, by the engineers and artillerymen and tankers and infantrymen who held the perimeter. The Australian War Memorial holds the records. The unit war diary, the after-action reports are available for researchers. The photographs show young men with 1,000-yard stares, exhausted faces, hollow eyes. The audio recordings capture voices recounting the chaos of close combat. The physical evidence remains. The damaged howitzer that is now on display in the War Memorial's galleries, pockmarked with shrapnel, a silent testament to the intensity of the fighting. The Victoria Cross recommendation for Private Richard Norton, later upgraded from the Distinguished Conduct Medal in 2024 after a tribunal review, recognizes individual heroism. The Military Cross awarded to Lieutenant Neil Weeks for his leadership when 3 platoon was overrun. The commendations and citations for dozens of soldiers who performed their duty under impossible circumstances. But perhaps the most important legacy is simply this. 3RR and the supporting arms of the 1st Australian Task Force held their ground. They built defences that should not have withstood human wave assaults. They fought with firepower and coordination and courage. They destroyed an elite North Vietnamese division. They turned what could have been an Australian disaster into an Australian victory. They proved that defensive positions, properly coordinated, with adequate firepower and determined soldiers, can defeat numerical superiority and aggressive assault tactics. The North Vietnamese learned at Balmoral that attacking Australian positions was suicidal. The 141st Regiment tried twice and was destroyed. The 165 Regiment tried twice and was destroyed. The 7th NVA Division learned that human wave assaults do not work against entrenched Australians with artillery support and armoured vehicles. The lesson was learned in blood, in the bodies piled in the wire at Balmoral, in the shattered rubber plantation at Coral, in the casualty reports that climbed higher with each failed assault. 56 years later, the jungle has reclaimed the battlefields. The fire support bases are gone, ploughed under, and returned to farmland. The rubber plantation at Coral has regrown. The area where D Company held the perimeter at Balmoral is peaceful countryside. There are no monuments marking where the guns stood, where the tanks fired, where the engineers held 1/3 of the perimeter and refused to break. But the battle is not forgotten. The veterans remember. The families remember. The historians record. And we remember here on Vietnam War Records, bringing you the detailed, historically accurate stories of courage and sacrifice that defined the Vietnam War. This is how 3RA destroyed the 7th NVA Division with human wave defences. This is how Australian soldiers turned defensive positions into killing fields. This is how 26 days of combat in May and June 1968 changed the course of the war in the 3rd Corps and wrote one of the most significant chapters in Australian military history. If you want more stories like this, more deep dives into the battles and tactics and experiences that defined Vietnam, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join the Vietnam War Records community. Because history this detailed, this accurate, this powerful, deserves to be remembered. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.